insatiable too muchness in the work, which makes it possible for the work to participate in the absolute, or to use Badiou's expression, allows the work to touch the attribute of the absolute, which is for Badiou truth. One of the important, although elementary lessons drawn from the theory of large cardinals in this specific context of the elaboration of the immanence of truth is namely that the lower ranking large infinities cannot reabsorb higher ranking large infinities. The axiom according to which V is not equal to L, the famous Scott theorem, again already mentioned by Noam, provides what is termed by Badiou as the theorem of limitation of the dominant ideology. There is, according to Scott's theorem, a large complex cardinal whose mere existence renders such an equivalence impossible. This theorem, strictly speaking, Badiou claims, draws the limit between the possible and the impossible. Thus, everything depends on the existence of a peculiar set called zero sharp, the problem of the set being that set theorists are confronted with the difficulty which consists in not being able to prove either that zero sharp exists or that it does not exist. If zero sharp does not exist, then, according to Badiou, operations of covering over are possible. The existence of zero sharp, by contrast, tells us that our creativity is not nothing. Better still, according to Badiou, it is better to catch the moment of the created existence of zero sharp than, out of fear of risk, to stick to simply zero. In a word, it is better to bet on zero sharp, that is to say, something which is almost zero, than zero pure and simple. We can see in the immanence of truth two important instances of a Mallarmian operation with presque, almost. Just as a truth is not the absolute, in participating in it, it is almost the absolute, which is, according to Badiou's reading of Spinoza, obvious, since truth is one of the absolute attributes. It is better to bet on the incalculable, uncertain, presque, almost zero of the zero sharp, than to opt for the certainty of zero. In the wordless times of the democratic materialism, in which almost none of the four truth procedures is flourishing or is active, with the exception of mathematics, the wager could be taken as the maxim of a provisory morals for action and thought. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jelita. I think what we should probably do now, because we should keep in mind that after all we're talking here about a book which for now exists only in French, and I think from these two talks you could already get at least some approximative idea of some concepts that appear in this book. But I would maybe right now invite Alain, asking you about a few terms, just like I'm thinking more as a professor right now than just asking intricate questions. So just for the public, so that if we could summarize, in 2 sentences, the meaning of some of these terms that appeared in Norman's and Jelita's talk. So Alain, I would maybe invite you if you could. So we spoke about the absolute universe V. That I think it's relatively clear that is the place of the all thinkable forms of multiplicity. So in a way, in mathematics we have sets and classes. Like the V is like from where we abstract those things, and the V as such is obviously not a set, it's a place. It's an open universe. But we also had this term, besides œuvre, we spoke about index, about the waste, the déchet. recouvrement, covering, and then to speak about the attributes of the absolute, the elementary embedding. So Alain, maybe just before we pass to questions, if you could, one by one, tell a few sentences just to explain those terms for people who maybe not have read the book in French.
But why in French?
Huh?
Why in French?
No, I mean we have English
Okay.
public, so they didn't
Okay.
read the French. Everyone.
But you can say the word,
Huh?
the
So,
list.
yeah, so if you can explain maybe by the index, l'index de l'œuvre.
Oh. I am not sure to understand. No, index is the name that I choose to designate the point of relationship of an oeuvre to its proper absoluteness. So, in some sense, is near the Platonist concept of participation that you know. Plato explained that we can have a universal name for something. For example, for a glass, because there is participation of the object, singular, absolutely singular, to what Plato names the idea of the glass. So it's the most enigmatic concept in all the construction of Plato, naturally. And it is why very often we have separation between the world of ideas, intelligible world, and the world of things, sensible world. But after that, to think the relationship between the two is very difficult at the end. So my problematic is in some sense the same, to think the relationship between a truth, in fact, because I name a truth a creation. The truth is not at all, in my philosophy, something, for example, that's a relationship between a thing and the name of the thing, or relationship between an idea and the language in which you say that idea. It's not, my definition of truth is not at all Aristotelian. For me, a truth is a creation. And this is why a truth can be a word of art, a theorem of mathematics, a declaration of love, and so on. So truth is always something which exists in the world. But the question is universality of truth, and to understand the universality of truth, we must think the relationship between the truth and something else than the world where the truth is created. Okay. This is why it's a Platonist question. And so the relationship between truth in the form of oeuvre with its possibility to be something absolute in some sense and not relative to the world, precisely. After that, we have a complex construction, in fact, a complex construction which implies first that the multiplicity, which is the truth, everything is a multiplicity, so truth is also a multiplicity, that the multiplicity cannot be covered completely by the finitude of the world where the truth is, cannot be suppressed in its universality by the particularity of the world. So we must have a theory of the possibility for a multiplicity to not be reduced to the finitude in the world where it is. And is the theory of non-constructible multiplicities. We can define with mathematical result, we can define finitude in a world to the possibility to be covered by a purely constructible multiplicity. And it's very interesting because a constructible multiplicity is a multiplicity which is composed of multiplicities. Every multiplicity is a multiplicity of multiplicities. There is no atoms, there is no treatment. And so a constructive multiplicity is the multiplicity where we can observe that this multiplicity is constructive because its proper elements are constructible at a primitive level. So there is a hierarchy of constructibility, of complexity, an analysis of complexity of a thing. And you have a very simple form at the beginning, and you have by a sort of scale, finally, we can measure the degrees of complexity of the thing at the end. And we can define conditions for a multiplicity not to be constructible in this sense. The first condition, if you want to escape the law of the world, you must have a non-constructible multiplicity. And when you have a non-constructible multiplicity, which cannot be recovered or reduced to something constructible, we can have a relationship between this multiplicity and the hierarchy of infinite, the scale of infinite. And so we have a relationship, finally, between œuvre and the infinite, by the mediation of non-constructibility. After that, you enter in the details. But the general idea, after all, is simple. And so, to understand completely the relationship between non-constructibility and the hierarchy of infinite, we have some mathematical theorems, the most important being that if exists a definite form of infinity, there exist non-constructible multiplicities. And it's the question of zero sharp. It's a very strange nomination, zero sharp. The musical invention of mathematicians is near zero, but not exactly zero. Zero just with something which is not zero. And it's the name for something, the existence of which creates the possibility, in fact, the ontological possibility of une œuvre, précisément, in the sense of that. And so, I name index the part of an œuvre which in some sense is made possible by its relationship to zero sharp. That is, to the possibility to be outside the constructibility. And finally, it's interesting also for analysis of works, of œuvres. You know, where you have something universal, it's very interesting to understand why something is universal and something else is not. In the field of artistic creation, of scientific demonstration and so on. And index is the name of this point. That is the point where a definite œuvre is in relationship to the possibility of universality by the mediation of its relationship to zero sharp. Alors, it's correct?
Oui, ça va. Do we have some questions for Yalitza? Yeah? And please speak.
Sure. I wanted to know if Immanence of Truths introduces a shift or a nuance to the affirmation that modern set theory is the foundation of an absolute ontology.
Est-ce que l'immanence de vérité propose quelques modifications par rapport à l'idée que la théorie des ensembles, c'est la base de l'ontologie?
I think that it's there is two different levels. At the purely ontological level, we have theory of sets uniquely because we assume that all what is a multiplicity. But I insist on the point that this point is a philosophical affirmation, after all. It's an axiomatic philosophical affirmation. There is some very different affirmation. For example, in the philosophy of vitalist orientation, as Deleuze, for example, we have much more the idea that being is composed of relationships and not of elements, and so on. Well, no, there is in my work a primitive choice, which is an ontological choice, which is to assume that the pure being of something is to be a multiplicity. You can say a multiplicity of what? But a multiplicity of multiplicities, precisely. That is the great argument in my conviction of choice, the thought of choice. Because if you say that you have relation, after that you have relation between what? In the case of multiplicity, there is no problem. The elements of a multiplicity are themselves multiplicities. So the concept of multiplicity is a pure concept of ontological nature. This is the first level. After that, we have the question of truth. The question of truth cannot be reduced to an ontological question, naturally. A truth is something which first is defined, which exists first in the world, which begins in the world, which is created in a specific world. So we must have a theory of what is the world, and the world is not reducible to being a pure multiplicity. So we must have a concept of existence, which is not reducible to being, because existence is to be a being in the world, and so on. So, at the end, the point is to appreciate the immanency of truth. that is the possibility of the ontological existence of truth and the existence of their universal value, even if they are created in a specific world. And for that, we must have a concept of the absolute. It's not sufficient to have ontology. We must have ontology of the absolute. And you observe that it is impossible to have, strictly speaking, ontology of the absolute. Why? Because the absolute must be defined as the totality of all possible forms of multiplicities. In my ontology, the natural definition of the absolute. The absolute is the totality of all possible forms of multiplicities, but mathematicians have demonstrated that the totality of all forms of multiplicities cannot be a multiplicity. So we are outside the ontology. We are at the limit of ontology. And the concept of absolute is, in some sense, inconsistent. And so my philosophy assumes that something which is inconsistent exists in some sense. Exists as precisely the possible value of something in the form of multiplicity. And it is why immanence of truth goes to the absolute limit of ontology itself to create the possibility of absoluteness of truth, and finally to give support to universality. Universality being genericity, but genericity alone is not sufficient to speak of absoluteness. That's why in immanence of truth we have finally ontology, donc theory of sets. We have theory of categories because we speak of world, and the world is not a set, it's a topos. It's a Grothendieck topos, precisely. And after that, we must speak of the absolute, which is neither a set nor a world, but something like an inconsistent totality, which, and we must assume the existence of the inconsistent totality as a guarantee of the existence of something universal.
I think we can accept one question if it's a question for Yelitsa. Is it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely easily based on the talk. I mean, given your work on Lacan, I was wondering where you could situate the difference to the mathème.
Well, yeah, this is a very tricky question because, I mean, there are several levels how one can, comment or not directly answer, but comment your question. I mean, Badiou uses Lacan's term mathème as an idea for, you see, if Lacan could be interesting for philosophers, this is precisely because he had invented this concept, mathème, to grapple with something which appears to be evading, escaping the possibility of conceptualizing the real. So he uses the mathème in order to be able to touch, not touch the absolute, but touch the real. No. So this is precisely where, of course, we have to take into account that we are talking about two, in a sense, completely heterogeneous fields of thinking. So we cannot make, this direct parallels between the two. But, the idea is the same. How? By using a concept or a mathème, we can, approach and deal with something which seems to be, impossible to reach in this way. So this is possibly the shortest answer to your question. But I might take up something which was asked in the previous question. I think it depends on how many of you were able to read Badiou's book in French, because the English chapter you were able to read can give you some idea, but you only realize that it gives you an idea once you have read the whole thing, so it's a kind of circularity. Now the problem, but you made another ontological decision, following, of course, the developments in the set theory, especially the Woodin, but not only. The question that for mathematician had to confront is what exactly is the nature of this V, which for Badiou has the role or has the status of this absolute referent. Is it something which can be fixed, which would mean, with the implication that all open or undecidable problems like the continuous hypothesis can finally get the final solution, or it is not possible. So we have two conceptions of the V. One is actualist, like actual infinities, so Gödelian initial idea, if the present status, axiomat status of set theory does not enable us, that is to say mathematician, to decide the undecidable, this is because we still haven't reached or formulated the adequate axioms. So this is a kind of, potentially, of course, we are getting there and we'll eventually get there. This is the idea which is behind the inner model program developed by Woodin. And there is another quite contrary position which say, no, V is not absolute, V is potentiality like potential infinity. So V is developing, we're never going to get a fixed and final version of V, So in between there is a position of multiverses which would say there is not one V, one universe of set, there is a myriad, infinite, the possibility of infinite universes of sets in which those open and undecidable questions could be true for some universes, but not for all. So, but you opt for the Woodin's conception. There has to be an ontological stability, because this is the condition of possibilities to be able to think that, which is in fact an undecidable, so the possibility of thinking truth as something universal which appears and reappears in words which seems to be excluding the universality of truth.
Shall we make a break, or is there one more urgent question for Janita? I think we'll make a break.
Yeah.
Oh,
No,
no?
we can break.
Okay, you can quickly.
I'm not sure it's quick. Maybe we should just break.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, just
Okay,
you can.
okay. You were speaking a lot, sort of, about mathematics as the world of possible forms of being, and sort of about possibility and potentiality, which made me think very much of sort of the gap between potentiality and actuality.
Yeah.
In the sense that if a truth is expressed within a world and its index being its relation to absoluteness, its possibility can be expressed before it's actualized. I'm thinking of Deleuze's essay on Mai 68 and sort of the fact that the field of possibilities was open, but then in the coming decades, none of these possibilities was actualized. And so what is the relationship between the instantiation of a possibility within a world and then its actualization within that world?
Oh, it's another very tricky question. I think Deleuze is not Badiou, so we have to decide for one or another. So we cannot, use parts of some we like and, combine with parts of another one, because I think they are, to a certain extent, quite incompatible positions. I think, that it doesn't go together. Now, concerning this question, where I see, that how Badiou, but maybe he could, provide a different answer to your question would be the following. I think the problem is not that there are possibilities, some of them are realized and some of them are not realized. I think the problem is rather, truth is created in a world, particular world, with possibilities which existed not, before this creation. All of these possibilities are not realized. But in a sense, they are not going to be realized, because once truth reappears in another world, there are new possibilities which are going to be open. So we cannot say, the same possibilities, are going to be realized in another world. No, in another world, with the resurrection, of the truth, of the subject of truth, new possibilities are going to be open. But we are still dealing with the same truth. So truth, in a sense, is invariable, but the possibilities depend on the way in which, of the words in which it appears. So this would be perhaps, the answer to your question.
Just one point. The idea, fundamental idea, is that if we cannot really have a complete access to the infinite, the total infinity of all possible forms of multiplicity, you can define what I name the attribute of the infinity in the sense of Spinoza. In Spinoza, you have also something like the absolute totality, substance, nature, it has many names in Spinoza, but we have the attribute of that sort of totality, which, says Spinoza, exprimes the totality. They contain in some sense the signification of the totality, being inside the totality, so not reducible to the totality, but finally having the structure of the totality. And human being knows two attributes, space and ideas, but there exist maybe infinity of possible attributes. Or we can appropriate this vision to a certain scale of a theory of sets, because we can have some in the totality of all possible forms of multiplicity, we can have some classes, in the name, the technical name, some classes which are inside this totality, but we can be defined really. We can have a definition. And so, even if it's not possible to go directly to the absolute totality, it's always possible to go to one class inside the totality, which exprime in some sense the structure of the totality itself, and which is exactly as the attribute of God in Spinoza. And so, a very interesting moment of the theory of sets at this level is to examine exactly what is that sort of attribute and how are their property. And the fundamental property is that if exists in a definite form an attribute of the absolute, there is something which exists really, that is, which is a set, which is a multiplicity, which is as the sign of the existence of the attribute. And this sign, which is a real multiplicity, so real being, must be a new form of infinity, a new scale in the scale of infinity. This theorem is, in some sense, one of the fundamental mathematical theorems which is used by me in Immanence of truth, because it's the key of the possible relationship at the end between concrete multiplicities and absoluteness of these concrete multiplicities.
Okay, so we'll make a break, and again, I invite you all to check our little book during the break, if you like, because it's probably, if you want to get it, you can probably get it today, and then on Friday, you probably know there's another talk by Alain Badiou at 5 p.m. Okay, and we'll probably finish a little bit later than we expected, but I think it should be fine. Badiou has proposed a new understanding of the attributes of the absolute, an understanding grounded in a complex mathematical theory of large cardinals, exploring the greatest forms of infinities that mathematicians are able to know. This book completes Badiou's philosophical project, in which he elaborated his mathematical ontology in order to surpass philosophy's capture by language, or what has been often named so-called linguistic turn. To linguistic algorithmic finitism, Badiou opposed a generic orientation of thought to the potential, or as Hegel would say, bad infinite. Badiou opposed the hierarchy of the multiple actual infinities, and to nominalism he opposed realist thinking. According to Badiou, philosophy cannot be captured by language, for if it was the case, philosophy would be reduced to a mere sophistry. Philosophy indexes the appearance of infinite and universal truths in a given world. And as we know, these truths are often indiscernible from the point of view of the dominant language. They originate in an illegal nomination of an event. Thus, a name such as French Revolution is always at the edge of the void, at the edge of the indiscernible. So either nothing has happened, or, in a way, everything has happened. There has been a revolution. So in my presentation today, what I would like to do is to place this book in the overall context of Badiou's philosophical endeavor. Thus, I will first mention Badiou's critique of constructivism, for the question of the language and the indiscernible or the unnameable is, in my opinion, crucial to understand the whole context of Badiou's work. In fact, Badiou's recent curious return to Spinoza is directed against another philosophical figure, which is that of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Abolishing Leibniz's principle of the identity of the indiscernibles was for Badiou a necessary precondition for building his philosophical edifice. In fact, the immanence of truth can be also interpreted as a way of weaponizing Spinoza against Leibniz. So after briefly evoking some concepts of Leibniz, I will conclude by discussing questions raised by the immanence of truth and the Spinozist notion of the attributes of the absolute developed in this book. In his philosophical project, Alain Badiou has been always convinced that the advances in set theory and in other fields of mathematics have serious implications for ontology and that they can't be ignored. According to Badiou, a number is a form of being, it is not a linguistic convention. And in his realist orientation of thought, Badiou often underscores that sets and numbers are not born from language. They are already there, they compose being qua being, and language can only define properties that carve out numbers and sets from the inconsistent background of the multiple. In other words, I quote Badiou, language cannot induce existence, solely a split within existence. Being must be already there. This clarifies why set theory does not contain a definition of the set for any definition, I quote, any definition is the linguistic mode of ascertaining the preeminence of beings. Badiou often refers to the so-called crisis of foundations in mathematics as a moment in which mathematics, I quote, is compelled to think its thought as the immanent multiplicity of its own unity. We know that, just to recapitulate, that responding to this crisis, thinkers have formulated three major ways out. So Gottlob Frege and Bertrand Russell attempted, in their respective logicist orientations of thought, and obviously these two orientations are quite different, to ground mathematics in fundamental logical principles. They posited logic as an epistemological foundation of mathematics. And David Hilbert's formalist approach conceived mathematics as a strict formal language grounded in axioms. In mathematics, contentious inference was to be replaced by what Hilbert described in a 1927 article, The Foundations of Mathematics, as, I quote, a manipulation of science according to rules. Since he strived to transform mathematics into a complete and consistent formal system, Hilbert took a strictly finitist approach, replacing all deductive methods based on the infinite, I quote, by finite procedures which yield exactly the same results. End of quote. And this quote comes from his paper on the infinite from 1925. So Hilbert rejected the notion of the actual infinity and assumed that, I quote, the infinite in the sense of an infinite totality is an illusion. This also comes from On the Infinite. So finally, in the third approach, thinkers following the so-called intuitionist approach opposed classical mathematics by rejecting the principle of the excluded middle and by conceiving all mathematics as a creation of the mind. A typical intuitionist, such as Lee E. J. Brewer, recognized, I quote, only the existence of denumerable sets, end of quote, and preferred the finite to the infinite. So intuitionists took a constructivist attitude and could, I quote, only construct denumerable sets of mathematical objects. And this comes from Brewer's paper, Intuitionism and Formalism, in 1912. So Badiou, who is a staunch reader of Plato, rejected all this discussion. In Being an Event, he labeled these three solutions as a so-called constructivism. For they share the focus on constructive methods, they negate the existence of the actual infinite, and see mathematics as, I quote, algorithmic or constructive finitism. For a constructivist, whatever is not distinguishable by a well-made language is not, and the language builds a proximity between the presentation and the representation. So in a way, there's no unnameable, there's no indiscernible, thus there's also no event. Constructivism operates through the logic of what Badiou names in the Immanence of Truth, le recouvrement, or covering over, I don't know how we translated it here. In this recouvrement, any new multiple must be composed from already existing multiples. This recouvrement, or covering, is a process by which a new emerging infinity is rendered finite by being covered by a multiplicity of finite sets. And we know that in the Immanence of Truth, finitude is, another name for constructibility. Constructibility equals finitude. So, or to give you Badiou's definition, I quote from the Immanence of Truth, any set can become a material for covering and thus become finite if it has as its sole elements other multiplicities that constituted definable parts in an already pre-existent and finite set. Such finite set will be said to be constructible, end of quote. So in other words, a set is finite or constructible if all its elements can be defined by a given language. In the constructivist orientation of thought, the mathematical real is subjugated to language. In mathematical terminology, the hypothesis that the word set denotes a finite or a constructible set is generally marked by the capital letter L. The capital letter V, on the other hand, describes the absolute class or the place of all thinkable forms of multiplicities we already spoke about. And this notion of the absolute class V plays, as we'll see later, an important role in Badiou's the Immanence of Truth. So, just to recapitulate, this V is itself not a set, it is not a mathematical object, it is rather something like a universe of mathematical thought, a place in which all thinkable forms of multiplicities are present. V is a mathematical universe composed of infinite sets and of classes, which are parts of V, containing all sets that have some well-defined property. I.e., we can have, for instance, an infinite set, but we can also have a class that cuts through multiple sets, such as, for instance, a class of all pair numbers in all infinite sets. So we can say that this V has a hierarchical organization, which, by the way, is often represented as a triangle standing on its top. So V is the absolute, or the absolute class. It is what Spinoza would call the substance. And Badiou notes in the Immanence of Truth that, by the way, the letter V reminds him of void, since all sets are built from the empty set, a universally included void. Or it reminds him of truth, or vérité in French. And then all the debate basically concerns the nature of this absolute class V. And by the way, it would be curious to think to what extent we find something like V in Leibniz and Spinoza. We could say that in a way, in both Leibniz and Spinoza, we can find something that really resembles to this absolute class. But in the case of Leibniz, it would be more like V equals L. It would be more the constructible hypothesis. So if we say, by the way, that this V equals L, then we are making a hypothesis of a constructible universe. That means we postulate the idea that there are no actual infinities and that the only thing that exists are finite constructible sets. Georg Cantor's continuum hypothesis affirms that there is no set which would be greater than the set of all integers and smaller than the set of all real numbers. Or in other words, that between these two infinities, there are no unknown infinite sets that we cannot so far describe by the properties of our language. And in the constructible universe L, Cantor's hypothesis must be necessarily and logically valid. So, in fact, this constructivism is precisely what Badiou has been contesting throughout all 3 volumes of Being an Event. In fact, I propose to rename his 3 major books 3 Critiques of the Constructible. In the most recent one, The Immanence of Truth, Badiou speaks in the chapter 19 of the crucial choice between the constructible or the generic orientation of thought. In this chapter, Badiou tells us that the role of events is, I quote, to put on the agenda the choice of whether to stay within the constructible or to abandon it. Ends of quote. He reminds us that from the mathematical point of view, both accepting and rejecting constructivism is possible. On the one hand, Kurt Gödel proved that it is possible to preserve the consistency of ZFC set theory by adding to it the axiom of constructibility. On the other hand, Paul Cohen in the 1960s invented a technique of forcing, showing that it was possible to admit the existence of non-constructible generic multiplicities. So both options are equally admissible for working mathematicians. Badiou notes, however, that the second option is more interesting, and I would say in an almost Pascalian wager, he decides for Cohen against Gödel. So this is a decision from which he starts. And this choice for him equals, I quote, affirming that there is the infinite, end of quote, that there is something unnameable or indiscernible that cannot be described by the language of the dominant order. Similarly, if we talk about it retrospectively from now, in Logics of Worlds, his book on being there, or existence, Badiou mobilized category theory in order to propose a new relationship between mathematics and logic, in which multiple forms of logics constitute only local dimensions of possible universes of mathematics. That means logic does not constitute a foundation of mathematics, and mathematics cannot be constructed on logical grounds. And in Being an Event, the first book, Badiou began his philosophical trajectory by embracing Paul Cohen. Cohen, in order to prove that Cantor's continuum hypothesis can be false and that the mathematical universe can be non-constructible, elaborated difficult mathematical technique of forcing, which consisted in building a generic extension by using the resources of a given model. In simpler philosophical terms, forcing can be understood as building the unnameable or the indiscernible by using the means of a given language. It might be perceived as an affirmation of the existence of the indiscernible of a non-constructible universe. The ethical position of a philosopher that we could deduce from Badiou's work is then that of someone like a tightrope walker, like the acrobat who walks on the rope. So a philosopher is like a tightrope walker. He is someone constantly balancing on the edge of the void, risking that he falls into the cliff. Philosopher is someone who defends the consistency of language against its inconsistent dissemination, while knowing that this language must necessarily remain incomplete, that there is no language that would exhaust the real of being without falling into problematic paradoxes. This brings me to the role that Leibniz plays in my narrative today. For if Badiou as a philosopher defends the consistency and incompleteness of philosophical language, then Leibniz stands on the opposite side, on the side of completeness and inconsistency. In fact, for Badiou, the forcing constituted a direct polemic with Leibniz's principle of the identity of indiscernibles. This principle appears in multiple formulations in Leibniz's works. For instance, in the early 1686 Discourse on Metaphysics, section 9, Leibniz claims that, I quote, "It is not true that two substances are completely alike, differing only numerically." Or, to give you a later formulation from the 1714 Monadology, I quote, "There are never in nature two beings that are perfectly alike and in which it would not be possible to find a difference that is internal or founded on an intrinsic denomination," end of quote. So, in other words, there's nothing in nature like two chunks of matter that would be identical and differ only numerically. Each chunk of the matter must have some intrinsic property that makes it different from another one. Similarly, there is no vacuum, according to Leibniz, for if there was a vacuum or a void, two different parts of an empty space could be perfectly similar and differ only in number alone, which, according to this principle, would be absurd. So we have to keep in mind that for Leibniz, the vacuum or the void is actually where the principle of the identity of indiscernible collapses. If we accept the existence of the vacuum and the void, then actually all this principle, just breaks down. So Leibniz actually derives his principle of the identity of indiscernibles from two other principles. The principle of contradiction, according to which a proposition cannot be true and false at the same time, and the principle of sufficient reason, according to which nothing is without reason and there is no effect without a cause. From all the possible worlds, God always chooses the best one. Even the presence of the evil in our world is justifiable by some reason which is accessible only to God and which makes that actually the bad world we live in is still the best when compared to other possible worlds. Thus, if we imagine that there were two identical objects that would differ solely in their extension, we could conceive also another possible world in which the object A could be replaced by the object B. If this was the case, God would have no reason to choose the world with the object A over the world with the object B. And since, according to the principle of the sufficient reason, God must have a reason for acting as he does, there can be no two indiscernible objects in a world. Thus, and I quote Leibniz here from the 1686 text, Primary Truths, that Leibniz says, I quote, there are no purely extrinsic denominations which have absolutely no foundations in the very thing denominated. End of quote. The notion of the subject denominated always contains the notion of the predicate. For instance, if Adam did not sin, he would have been some other Adam and not the Adam that we know. Everything that will happen to Adam is contained in the perfect individual notion of Adam. Each substance has some complete individual concept, a concept that contains in it all the predicates of its past, present, and future. Had we possessed such complete individual concept, we could make a logical deduction of all the predicates that are true of a given subject. The notion of a substance includes everything that can ever happen to it. And again, here, when I talk substance in Leibniz is something completely different, than in Spinoza. It's more like the multiple monads and so on. It has actually nothing to do. The notion of a substance includes everything that can ever happen to it, and I quote here, the point 13 from Discourse on Metaphysics, I quote, by considering this notion, we can see in it everything that can be truly stated about it, just as we can see in the nature of the circle all properties that can be derived from it. End of quote. Every object or figure has some complete concept, or as Leibniz states in Primary Truths, I quote, when the denomination of a thing is changed, there must be a variation in the thing itself. So already from my brief recapitulation of Leibniz, and obviously this recapitulation is very summary, we can see that for Leibniz, the language controls the real. So to paraphrase Badiou, we can say that for Leibniz, language does not make a split in existence, it induces existence. In a way, Leibniz is a philosopher of the constructivist orientation of thought, and it is not by chance that thinkers such as Bertrand Russell or Gottlob Frege often referred to Leibniz, and for instance, especially in the case of Frege, often directly use his definitions. For Leibniz, God equaled the language that governs being according to a universal harmony, and the philosopher's unfulfilled dream was precisely to master this language. For were we able to learn this divine philosophical language, we could directly think the laws of being, which are, by the way, logically coherent. We could, in a way, reduce all complex statements to simple tautologies. It would be impossible to talk nonsense, short or bref. All these things would lead us to an even greater admiration of God. Thus, God for Leibniz was something like a book of the possible, a complete algorithm controlling our world. Paraphrasing the famous movie by Jean-Luc Godard, we could say that Leibniz God was the Alpha 60 processor governing our world, a processor which knows no event, no contingency, for even the miracles are not really so miraculous, since they follow some logic inherent to the divine reason and inaccessible to the human one. One thing that always strikes me while reading Leibniz is the problem of the relationship between the discrete and the continuous. The problem which obviously appears also at the origin of the set theory in which Badiou's thinking is grounded. How is it possible that Leibniz affirms on the one hand that nature is continuous, and that in nature nothing is born and nothing perishes, and that the matter is infinitely divisible, but on the other hand, to deal with this continuity, he ends up positing an infinite number of simple substances. These substances are Leibniz's famous monads, and each monad is a singularity. There are no two monads that would be the same. It is almost as if the relationship between the nature and the language was modeled according to the mathematical relation between a geometric line and the number of points on the line. That means between the continuous and the discrete. The philosopher's desire to name all the points on the line, to name all the substances within nature, make him fall into necessary paradoxes, into the abyss of language. Leibniz might have abolished the unnameable or the indiscernible, yet the repressed indiscernible indiscerns his philosophical system from within. So it might be for this reason that in Being an Event, Badiou directly rejected Leibniz's principle of indiscernibles. He remarks, I quote, that the indiscernible is the ontological predicate for an obstacle for language, end of quote. If two beings are indiscernible, language cannot separate them. Even Leibniz is aware that the existence of the indiscernible would introduce nothingness into being. I quote, "If the void exists, language is incomplete," remarks Badiou. Yet if the existence of the void was a hindrance for Leibniz, for Badiou, on the other hand, every consistent language is necessarily incomplete and the void is universally included. And if for Leibniz, God is the language in its supposed completion, Badiou deduces from that simply that there is no God. There is no transcendent divinity, there are multiple immanent divinities. That means the infinite and universal truth grounded in events. In the technique of forcing, on which Badiou modeled his theory of the truth procedure and of events, the mathematician Paul Cohen takes the names of given constructible model M, and on the basis of those names, he builds a so-called generic extension MG. From the point of view of our model M, the generic extension is indiscernible. It follows different rules than our model. In other, simpler terms, Cohen uses the names of our language to build the unnameable, to build what is beyond our language. And this beyond, this generic extension, is not transcendent. It is not a miracle coming from the outside of our world. Rather, it is like